I was bleeding internally as the ambulance barreled down Main, and the world had reduced to two things: the metallic taste of panic in my mouth and the tiny, impossible thought that my 3-year-old twins Lily and Lucas were somewhere in the apartment without me. I fumbled for my phone between the damp folds of my shirt, thumbs shaking too much to be steady. I called the only people who could have done it for me without question: my parents. "Please," I said into the receiver, breathless, "someone has to be with the kids, Helen." "Richard." The line clicked. Silence. Then a text arrived, the letters stark as a blade against my chest. I remember reading it as if watching someone else. "You've always been a nuisance and a burden. We already have tickets for the show." Those words don't translate on paper the way they land inside your body. In that moment, with the siren washing everything into blue and red streaks, they were not just a sentence. They were a verdict that came faster than any surgeon could get to the OR. I stared at the little white box until the paramedic asked me what's wrong, and I tried to explain why the sting was louder than the pain. If you've ever been gaslit by family, type truth in the comments. They tell you trauma narrows your world down to essentials. For me, it was who would pick up my kids. For my parents, apparently, their plans came first. I did what I had to because being abandoned on the pavement in the middle of March did not expand my options. I called Marcus. Marcus is an old friend from residency, a man who knows how to keep a cool voice when he needs to. When he arrived, the ambulance docs were prepping me, murmuring about blood pressure and bradycardia and how bad it looked. Marcus never lets panic leak into his face. He just became my anchor. He found a sitter through an agency in 20 minutes, relayed my address, and stayed with me until they wheeled me past the sliding doors. His hand on my shoulder said more than any family photograph ever had. The surgeons later told me I had a ruptured spleen and internal bleeding. They patched me up and kept me in ICU overnight, lying under fluorescent light, unable to move without a spasm of pain. My head filled with a stream of images that weren't about the next scan or the drip in my arm. They were of bills, of transfers disappearing from my bank account each month, of automatic withdrawals I'd set up years ago because asking felt impossible. And because my parents, Helen and Richard, had always been so proud of Vanessa. Vanessa, my older sister, had a way of walking into a room and having it realign around her. As a child, she got the applause, the extra slice of cake, the good job that stuck. I learned early to shrink so someone else could be seen. I learned how to be useful. I learned to be invisible in service of the family's image of itself. I became a cardiology resident the hard way: long nights, exams, a stack of unpaid internships and cheap apartments, and I loved what I did with that stubborn, careful kind of love. It felt like work with a soul. But while I was in scrub rooms and on call, sending pages of reports and taking shifts to save other people's hearts, my parents were saving their life in a different way. Mine, financially. It started modestly. A transfer here, a dinner paid there, helping with a busted heater in winter. I told myself it was family. We do for each other, I said. But help had a way of calcifying into habit. What began as occasional support became an automatic $3,750 sliding out of my account every month. For 8 years. I didn't know it was that much until the night after the surgery, when fatigue and pain and something like clarity combined, and I opened my banking app. Seeing it in a line of figures on my phone, $3,750, $3,750. $3,75, month after month for 96 months, added up to a number that hit harder than the IV stand, roughly $360,000. For 8 years, I had been funding their life in silence, a silent subsidy to their mortgage, to insurance premiums, to repairs, and to whatever else they chose to put it toward, mostly things that never made space for me. Why did I keep doing it? Maybe because guilt is a smaller, more manageable monster than confrontation. Maybe because my mother's voice, soft and precise, had learned how to make my wants seem selfish. Maybe because when you've been trained to be the responsible one, it becomes easier to shoulder everyone else's needs than to ask for your own. I told myself that this was how families survive. I told myself I was doing the right thing. I told myself a lot of things to keep on paying. The crash, made the telling impossible. When I could finally walk without the nurse's help and my wrists weren't sticky with monitoring gel, Marcus sat with me and looked at my screen. I didn't have to explain much. He knew me enough to know what that sequence of withdrawals meant. He didn't blink when I told him I had been sending the money for 8 years. He didn't tell me I'd been a fool. He said, "You deserve to know where your priorities are," and left it at that. I spent that pale afternoon building a ledger where one hadn't existed for me before. I printed statements, copied text chains, wrote dates beside months, circled totals, and in the margins, I wrote what the transfers had covered when I could find the receipts. A mortgage payment here, an insurance premium there, a new set of tires, a sponsorship for Vanessa's fledgling label, the year she had no clients but plenty of ambition. Some months were annotated with no receipt found, which told me as plainly as any ledger that the money had been fungible, used to plug holes, pay for comforts, lift Vanessa into places I had worked to make room for. I had kept this going partly because I was afraid of being the bad daughter. The cultural language my parents used about family duty had been steady and precise. Provide, sacrifice. Oh, the more I learned to be self-sacrificing, the more invisible my own needs became, and the more I kept paying, the easier it became to believe that my boundaries would be an act of selfishness. That night, alone in my hospital room while the city breathed through the window, I stopped telling myself stories to justify my quiet financial hemorrhage. I set up 2 things, one small and one large. The small was practical. I called the bank's fraud line and downgraded every automatic transfer I found. I set up alerts and changed passwords. I added a second layer of verification to the accounts I'd used without thinking. The large was something I hadn't even spoken aloud. I decided to stop. Not to cut off help if they needed it, maybe someday, but to stop the pattern that had become my life. To stop being the bank that financed someone else's choices while mine remained deferred. I remember typing the word cancel into the transfer settings and feeling a kind of vertigo, a terrible, promising hollow where my guilt used to sit. Blocking their numbers felt obscene in that moment, an act, both petty and seismic, but I did it. I sent a short message later that afternoon, from my phone between beeps, because I couldn't leave even that communication undone. I wrote, "I need you to know I was in an accident. The kids are safe. I'm canceling the automatic transfers. We will discuss this later." I didn't say it with heat. I said it with a brittle, quiet accuracy that surprised even me. I didn't need to explain the ledger. I didn't need to justify the choice. For the first time in a long time, I chose my children first and my compulsion to be indispensable second. News of the cancellation spread faster than I thought it would. Mom called and texted, at first with shock, then with anger. Dad's voice in the messages was terse, protective, as if my decision had been a personal affront to the family honor. Vanessa sent a long string of exclamation points, and then, after a gap, a message about fairness and family obligations. None of those messages mentioned the fact that, while I was being cut open on a hospital table, their immediate reaction to my crisis had been performative insistence on attendance at events that mattered to them, more than the safety of their grandchildren. In the quiet before discharge, my head cleared in a way it hadn't when the anesthesia still laced through my body. The ledger lay in front of me on the hospital tray, Marques's pen beside Ida, witness, not an interpreter. I showed Aunt Eleanor the spreadsheet when she came with a thermos of tea and a softness that made the room feel less clinical. She wept once, quick and shocked, and then she closed her face into a determination that looked like a stranger. "This isn't right," she said. "We need to make this public. He needs to know the numbers." "Who?" I asked, rubbing a thumb over the printed dates. "Your grandfather, Thomas. He has a way with people, and he will be 80 in June 75. Sarah, he's having a small dinner. He can get them to listen." She listens to herself, and then corrected, 70. He's doing a party. It would be a better stage than a private talk. He has respect in ways none of us do. Grandpa Thomas had, in his private life, been a retired federal judge. In family lore, he was the kind of man whose presence meant a room weighed itself differently. He rarely involved himself in family squabbles. He kept his judgments measured, his visits infrequent and special. If anyone could bring gravity to a ledger, it was him. He also, had Aunt Eleanor reminded me, no tolerance for pretense. that straight, quiet honesty had been a comfort and a terror to our family for as long as I could remember. I had never imagined putting our private failures on display. I had always been the one to tidy the corners so no sharp edges showed. But the night after the surgery, with my skin healing and my rage, a small, steady ember, the idea of letting Grandpa read the ledger out loud began to feel less like vengeance and more like necessary light. There is a difference, I thought, between exposing someone to shame and refusing to be erased again. They joked quietly, nervously, that exposing it at his birthday would be dramatic. In truth, it would be surgical, clean, clinical, a steady voice reading a series of numbers and dates. Aunt Eleanor looked at me and said, "He will read exactly what you show him. He will say what needs to be said." When Grandpa arrived at the hospital, the gravity about him had softened into something like warmth. He held my hand for a while and spoke of small comforts, how the hospital gardens were in bloom, how the nurses behaved like an orchestra. Then, with a judge's economy of language, he asked for the folder. He leafed through the printouts as if reading a case file, deposits, dates, annotations, the little notes about Vanessa's startup in instances where no receipt implied money siphoned to places not rendered to family memory. "Do you want me to say anything now?" he asked. I thought of the ambulance, of the text, of the sitter at my apartment who later told me about Lily painting with strawberries because she hadn't wanted to waste jelly. I thought of Lucas falling asleep on the sofa, arms flung over his blanket like a tiny flag. I thought about every dinner I'd skipped so my parents could be comfortable, about the quiet of my own wants stacked behind other people's needs. "No," I said. "Not now. Please, let me come to your dinner. Let it be in front of them. Let it be in a place where they can't ignore it." He nodded. There was no expression of triumph, no relish. He folded the papers and put them into a slim leather envelope. "I will tell the family at the party," he said, and I could hear the careful, deliberate decision in his voice. "They will hear the numbers. They will hear the message." I left the hospital with stitches and a list of things to avoid, and a strange sense that my life had turned a corner sharp enough to cut. The apartment smelled the same when I walked back in. Faint lemon from the cleaner I'd used in a rush, a crayon mark on the kitchen table, a high care with half a bagel stuck under its tray. The citoyen earnest woman named Mara, who smelled of ginger, had laid out toys and photos. Lily hugged me with all the ferocity of a child who thinks the universe is repairable with hugs and glue and chocolate. I made tea and sat on the floor with them, watching them play. My heart, the organ I had devoted my career to, felt fragile in an unfamiliar way. I had stitched myself back together in the body, but the small, persistent ache under the ribs where obligation had once nested had to be addressed. I decided, with the clarity of someone who'd seen mortality's face too closely, that my children would not grow up learning to prioritize other people's comfort above their own. The first step was practical. The second was public. I called Marcus and Aunt Eleanor and told them the plan in parts. Ledger, envelope, Grandpa's birthday. Marcus answered with a single word. "When?" Aunt Eleanor said, "We will do this right." Marcus said, "Protect yourself. Yes, make sure you have support the night he says this." They both understood the unspoken. Exposure could hemorrhage in ways paperwork couldn't predict. People could be angry. People could turn, but that was the point. No more quiet acquiescence. No more silent payments that built someone else's life at the expense of my children's. The next few days were a blur of recovery and preparation. I found myself cleaning the apartment with a feverish, automatic motion, throwing out receipts, setting aside old tax returns, printing more statements. I made a list of who would be at Grandpa's dinner and who would likely defend my parents as reflex. I annotated names in the ledger beside each line, like a historian trying to make narrative out of transactions, dates, amounts, notes, mortgage, insurance, donation to Vanessa's brand, no receipt. Vanessa called twice. Once she asked if I was really going to do this. The second time she asked if I would at least talk to them privately. I told her I had tried private. The carapace of silence and performative duty had worn me thin. I told her I wasn't doing this to humiliate anyone. I was doing this so that my kids could see a parent choose them. People kept asking if I wanted therapy, if I wanted to mediate. I answered as best I could that this wasn't theater. It wasn't revenge. It was a refusal to keep being the bank for someone else's choices. It was, in small, stubborn terms, a boundary. When the envelope with my ledger rested under Grandpa Thomas's old hand, it felt less like a weapon and more like evidence and evidence. I decided deserved to be seen. I didn't want to break my family. I wanted the family we had been pretending to be to stop pretending. The party, for all its potential awkwardness, offered a place where truth had to meet faces. People could not scroll past it on a news feed. They would be there, in a room, making decisions about how they would respond to facts. The paragraph I wrote for myself, factual set, in a draft message on my phone. My ledger will be read at Grandpa's dinner. This is not a call for punishment. This is a call for accountability. I will be there with Lily and Lucas. I didn't send it. Sending felt like a performance. Not sending felt like a slow, steady refusal to bow. A week later, Grandpa called and said he had cleared an hour at the dinner. He spoke with the calm precision of a man used to making rulings. I will read what is in that folder, he said. I will not. He paused. I will not vilify individuals beyond what the facts demand. I will present what was done and its impact. He was not a man who loved spectacle. He was a man who believed that a well-placed sentence in a room full of people could reset expectations. I felt, beneath the fear, an odd sense of permission. Permission to stop apologizing for my life. People told me I was brave. They told me I was cruel. The comments sat on my shoulders like a coat I couldn't shrug off. But the more I thought about the ambulance, the way those words had arrived while I was vulnerable, the more I knew that keeping silent in the face of that casual cruelty was a way of perpetuating it. Underneath everything, there was a simpler truth I didn't quite admit to myself until much later. I was tired of explaining why I mattered. I was tired of triangular loyalties that pinned my needs to the ceiling like something to collect dust on. I wanted my children to learn that parents could err, that grandparents could be fallible, but that you could also choose the people who upheld you. I wanted them to learn that boundaries were not betrayals, but templates for a life that could be kinder because it was honest. The preparations continued. We mailed out some invitations. I arranged for a trusted friend to sit with Lily and Lucas in the corner of the room where they could feel the hum of adults, but not be swallowed by it. Marcus promised to be there. Aunt Eleanor made lists of what to say if the room tilted toward outrage. My hands, still stiff from the incision, were steadier when sifting these practicalities than they had been the night of the crash. The week of the party, I found myself circling through memory like someone unpacking a box of old photographs. I remembered Vanessa at 12, opening a magazine and mapping out designs on the back of napkins. I remembered my parents sitting in the front row of every recital Vanessa had. While my own medal ceremonies were noted and then blurred, I remembered the first time I had set up an automatic transfer, a mixture of shame and obligation. The rationalization that whispered, "You can do this because you can afford it." It is easier to give than to be confronted with the eighth. It is possible to live inside a pattern for years and have no idea how to undo it until something yanks you in ambulance, a rebuke, a moment of clarity. For me, the moment that yanked my life into a different shape was a white rectangular text that refused to keep my loyalty. The rupture had been literal and figurative. On the morning of Grandpa's dinner, the house smelled like fresh coffee and something else attention you could almost taste. I dressed carefully, as if preparing for surgery. There is a ritual in choosing clothes for a public test. You want to be visible but not theatrical, dignified but not defensive. Lily insisted I wear the blue sweater. She said it made me look like a heart doctor from one of her picture books. Lucas wanted to bring his stuffed dinosaur, which I said he could if he promised not to roar during speeches. Grandpa arrived earlier than expected, as judges tend to do, and he came with a small leather envelope mine. Now, he placed it on the table between us as if it were a book. For a moment, we sat in the domestic quiet, and I felt the weight of everything that had been put there. The money, the silences, the choices. "Are you sure?" he asked. I nodded. My voice was small, but steady. "I'm sure." He stood, buttoned his coat with the deliberateness of someone fastening a life into place, and said, "Then let's go. We'll give them truth. They'll have to choose what to do with it. We walked to the car and I felt the old, familiar surge of adrenaline, the pulse that had been born in residency nights and crash calls. The same pulse that had driven me into medicine in the first place. I thought about the two little people at home who would come to know their mother not as someone who always yielded, but as someone who chose them in a moment that mattered. The car pulled up to the small banquet room where the family would gather. Outside, people laughed and exchanged greetings. Inside, the tables were set with linens and silverware, which seemed suddenly trivial and also terribly important. The air smelled of roasted chicken and citrus. I felt each step like a mediation between the life I had been living and the one I was trying to build. Then, as Grandpa straightened his jacket and tucked the leather folder under his arm, an old, small voice in me wondered if truth at a celebration would look like a scandal or a clearing. Would people applaud? Would they retreat into offense? Would they choose to see what they had been part of? I had no illusions about smoothness. I knew there could be fallout, harsh words, faces hardening, parents retreating. I had even imagined the possibility that they might leave the room. That image visited me like a bad dream. We entered the room. Conversations dipped as he walked in, respect like a shadow. I saw Vanessa across the table with a friend, and my parents near the head of the table, greeting cousins and nieces as if the world had not recently shifted beneath my feet. I could taste the salt of my own composure on my tongue. Grandpa found a place to stand. He opened the folder with slow, almost judicial precision and looked at me once, as if to ask permission. I nodded. He cleared his throat and began. He read in a voice that had long years of public speaking behind it. Numbers, dates, transfers, a factual cadence that made the facts impossible to ignore. He read where money had gone and where it had not. He read the text from the ambulance. He read the short messages and the dates that aligned like constellations on a map no one had bothered to study until now. At first, the room seemed to hold its breath. Then, reactions became a tide: surprise, disbelief, quick defenses. I felt myself standing there, not very tall among relatives, feeling as if the ledger on the table had become a kind of mirror. Some faces softened in the way sadness does. Others hardened like stone. I felt my chest tighten, not with fear but with something like relief. The truth was in the room now, not a rumor or a quietly carried burden. I began to speak, not to plead, not to shame, but to explain out loud why I'd stopped the transfers. My words were short and precise. I told them about the ambulance, about the message that had arrived when I needed them most. I told them I wasn't asking for punishment. I said I wanted accountability, and that for me, accountability meant my life could no longer be the default safety net for everyone else's choices. The murmurs rose and fell. Vanessa's mouth pressed into a thin line. My parents' faces were a study in compact defenses. People took sides like reflex, yet in the midst of it, Aunt Eleanor squeezed my hand, and Marcus, standing steady in the back, gave me a look that said, without words, "You did the right thing." As Grandpa finished, the envelope closed like a book shut on a case. For a second the room was a vase waiting for someone to decide into which branch the water would pour. I could feel the beginning of consequences unfurling. Some would be small and private. Some, I knew, might be visible. I braced myself, but I did not flinch. Outside, in the hallway, someone asked Grandpa if this was necessary. He answered frankly, "I have known both of their parents a long time. I know what concealment can do. Facts are sometimes the only medicine that will heal a family." Inside, a conversation was starting that would rearrange relationships. People were speaking in low voices, counting, refusing, justifying, or quietly hoping, and as the room divided in whispers, I felt, strangely, an updraft of something like freedom. We had reached a point where the story could no longer be contained in the neat rectangles of bank statements. It had spilled into a room full of people. The ledger had become more than numbers. It had become a demand. Choose where you stand. I left the room with Lily's hand in mine, feeling the thread of her small fingers, wind like a rope pulling me forward. I did not know how many bridges the ledger would burn or what doors it would open. I only knew that when I had called for help from an ambulance months earlier and had been called a burden, I had felt the shattering of a trust I hadn't known I was carrying. Standing in the stairwell for a moment, I looked at Grandpa as he spoke with relatives, and I felt the weight of what we had set into motion. The rest of the night stretched before us. I could hear murmurs beyond the heavy doors. I knew families were messy. I also knew that for the first time in a long time, the life I had been shouldered into would be contested. In the hush that came as people moved between tables, I felt my resolve settle like a garment around my shoulders. This would not be the end of pain. It would not be the end of confusion. It would, however, be the beginning of not letting my children grow up thinking they had to pay for other people's comfort. We returned home that night with Lily asleep on my shoulder and Lucas tucked into his car seat, thumb in his mouth. The city lights blurred into a smear and then a steady stream as I drove. Somewhere between the traffic lights and the empty apartment, I realized that the ledger had done something more than expose numbers. It had set a border. Borders are not walls. They are lines that tell others where you end and they begin. For the first time, I had drawn one. There would be fallout, social slips, angry conversations, financial adjustment, but there would also be reallocation. Funds that had kept others afloat would now go into a college account for Lily and Lucas, into rent in a smaller, safer place for us, into medical safety netting that would keep us from living on the edge again. Aunt Eleanor and Marcus helped me sketch budgets that felt less like deprivation and more like stewardship. Grandpa offered quiet counsel about the importance of documenting choices and explaining them plainly to family. As I lay awake that night, cataloging the night's events in my mind, to small bodies breathing down the hall, I felt the kind of fatigue that is built from more than stitches. It was the exhaustion of someone who has toured the line between duty and erasure for years and finally chooses herself. I thought of my parents, of Vanessa, of the ledger, of the envelope now stashed in Grandpa's safe hands. I thought of the ambulance text like a stone dropped into a still pond, ripples spreading, reaching places they hadn't before. I didn't know what would happen next. I only knew there would be consequences in plain view, decisions to be made by people who had been comfortable not making them, conversations that would have to be had about the cost of care and the cost of invisibility. But for the first time in years, I felt my life not as a ledger that belonged to someone else, but as a carefully guarded account of what mattered most to my children, my work, my ability to breathe. The next morning, before coffee, I found an email in my inbox from a cousin I hadn't expected to hear from. It was short. If you need anything, it read, underneath a list, dates, times, offers. Someone had shifted sides. The ripple was doing its work. I taped a copy of the ledger into a small notebook and stuck it under the pillow in my bedroom, the place I had once kept letters and cheap jewelry, a private archive of small treasures. It felt appropriate to keep proof of what had happened close at hand, not as a trophy, but as a record. There was still the matter of reconnecting the practical pieces of our lives. I had to find a new apartment, one that didn't require me to subsidize others simply to be sheltered in my own roof. I had to redirect the money into savings accounts, to set up a 529 for Lily and Lucas. I had to answer questions from relatives who were hurt on behalf of my parents, from Vanessa who felt exposed, and from my parents themselves who now, suddenly, had to reckon with living with less. I expected, privately, that they would react with anger first. Anger is often the first garment people put on when faced with their own missteps. I did not expect, and yet, part of me did hope that when the initial flare cooled, someone would notice the gap in their lives and the quiet drain that had been sustaining their comforts. Hope is a dangerous thing, fine and necessary and naive. I held it like one might hold a fragile cup. Weeks after the party, small consequences began to appear. A notice about overdue mortgage payments came in for my parents. Vanessa's brand took a hit when a creditor refused new terms. A cousin who had always deferred to my parents began calling me quietly, with questions that sounded like apologies. None of that was a triumph. It was a series of practical results from a set of choices I had made in a hospital bed where the life I knew had been at risk. What I spent most of my energy on in those weeks, though, was rebuilding. My new apartment wasn't big, but it was ours. I painted Lily's room a bright, determined yellow and Lucas's a calm green. I set up the college account and made the first automatic deposit, small but symbolic, like a seed planted where there had been empty soil. Marcus installed a second smoke alarm because the old one had a battery that was always dying. Aunt Eleanor brought casseroles and a quiet bravado that made good food feel like a blessing. Grandpa came by with a bag of groceries and a smile that didn't have to explain anything. On Jed nights after the twins were asleep, I would sit on the balcony with a blanket and listen to the soft hum of the city. I would think about what boundary meant for me now. It wasn't a punitive thing. It was a maintenance of life. It was a way of ensuring that if another ambulance ever came, there would be hands ready to take my children without hesitation. I didn't tell everyone everything. I learned to be selective with my explanations because some conversations are better had privately and others need the light of a room. I also learned that exposing truth doesn't necessarily make wounds disappear. It makes them visible, and then the real work begins to heal or to let go. One afternoon, a few weeks into our new routine, Grandpa called and said he wanted to come by. He had that look he gets when he is about to speak plainly. He brought the leather envelope with him. He set it on the kitchen table and, without ceremony, said, "I don't expect you to forgive them today. I don't expect them to change overnight. But I do expect that from now on, your needs will have a place at the table." I nodded because he was right. It wasn't about demanding retribution or throwing stones. It was about making sure our lives weren't spent in the quiet labor of other people's comforts while ours unraveled. That night, I felt something which, though not the absence of pain, was a newness. An arrangement where my children were the priority in a way that was visible, tangible, and irreversible. There were hard conversations ahead. There were hospital follow-ups, budget adjustments, tense family dinners. There was also the small, steady joy of watching Lily stack blocks with a patient concentration that made me believe in the future she would build, and Lucas singing the same two notes over and over like a prayer. Looking back to the ambulance moment, I understand now that the thing that broke me open was also the thing that allowed light in. The text, sharp and cruel as it was a mirror that reflected what had always been true. I had been carrying more than I could afford emotionally or financially. The ledger made it visible. Grandpa's willingness to bring it into a public room made sure it could not be swept aside again. There are no neat endings in stories like this, just changes in shape. Families shift, loyalties move, and people choose. Some choose to stay where they have always been. Some move toward the new borders you place in your life. Some bridges close, and others strangely, wonderfully open. In the weeks after the dinner, the shifts that had only been murmurs in the corner of the room began to take shape in concrete, often inconvenient ways. I started getting the kinds of calls I had only imagined in the margin of my ledger, people asking questions about mortgages, about overdue notices, about how a family that had always seemed steady suddenly had holes in its finances. At first those calls came like small, dull pebbles at my door. Then the pebbles turned into letters, formal, business-like, about late payments. And one day an envelope arrived with the name of the mortgage company on the front. There was no dramatic headline attached to it. There never is. There was only the quiet arithmetic of things you thought were steady and the slow, inexorable consequence of them not being so. My parents handled that practical unraveling in the way they'd handled most uncomfortable things, with a kind of brittle dignity. And then, when the dignity didn't hold, with silence, Helen's voice on the phone shifted between defensive and pleading. Richard answered fewer calls and favored curt, clipped texts that said little and meant less. I heard through cousins and once directly from Vanessa that the house needed repairs they had deferred, that insurance deadlines had loomed, that late fees had mounted because the monthly safety net had been, quite literally, withdrawn. No one called this justice in the formal sense. It was accounting. Vanessa's business took a hit, too. Clients who had once paid modest retainers folded when they learned that a favored family member's funding was no longer forthcoming. A launch was delayed because a supplier refused to extend net terms. A magazine that had once shown interest didn't follow through. These were not catastrophes in the sense that they destroyed her life, but they were defeats that had a sound, the dull thunk of a door closing that had once been propped open by invisible hands. I felt the ache of that compassionate twist in my chest because she was my sister and because I had been complicit, in a way, by helping to prop that door. But complicity and repair are not the same thing. I had to let her face the consequences of choices my money had cushioned. There were fewer family invitations after the party. People who had once invited us to holidays now deferred with vague schedule conflicts. A couple of cousins stopped responding to texts for a while. At one small family gathering, after the dust had settled a bit, a distant aunt asked me over coffee in a tone between curiosity and guilt why I had done it at Grandpa's party instead of privately. I answered as I had before, because the facts needed a place where they couldn't be ignored. Publicity, in this narrow sense, was not spectacle. It was a way to make sure the ledger could not be smoothed out with excuses. The practical consequences for my parents were not theatrical. There was no instant disowning of comfort or worldly things. What happened was more gradual and quieter, tightened budgets, phone calls with collection agencies, a slow recalibration of lifestyle. There were, for a time, nights when the lights seemed dimmer in the photos they posted to social media, or meals that looked more modest. I saw notices about refinance options and realized that someone who had once floated on a steady monthly lifeline was now having to make decisions that were hers to have made long ago. It was painful to see. It was also, frankly, not my duty to fix. That was the hard edge of the decision I had made in the hospital bed. Choosing my children and my life meant that others would have to live with the consequences of choices they'd been making for years. That idea sits uneasily in your chest, not because it's unkind in principle, but because it breaks the usual choreography of family where you give and you justify the giving with a steady drumbeat of, we do for each other. Boundaries reconfigure choreography. They invent new dances that some people will not like. A few family members who had always been quietly aligned with me began to appear with more regularity. The cousin who sent the email offering help suddenly began bringing casseroles and dropping texts about playdate. Aunt Eleanor became a near constant presence, bringing not only lasagnas and advice but also a certain moral steadiness that made my life feel less like a negotiation and more like an intentional project. Marcus, bless him, was there in the practical ways, rearranging bookshelves, helping me mount a baby gate properly, staying late some evenings when I had to work nights and couldn't ask for conventional childcare. Grandpa, for his part, never played the role of the crusader. His involvement was quieter. Counsel over tea, visits that were rich with reading and odd little jokes about procedural minutiae. He would occasionally hand me back the leather envelope with a new note tucked inside, a list of dates and a simple observation. You acted in favor of your children. He refused congratulations. You did what you needed to do, he'd say, as if the sentence were almost too small for what had happened. He would then change the subject with the gentle skill of someone who understood that truth needed to be lived with, not brandished. In the months that followed, I set more practical things in motion. I signed the lease on a small apartment a few neighborhoods over, a place with clean light and 2 bedrooms that smelled faintly of eucalyptus when we walked in. I spent one afternoon measuring closet space with Lily pressing a measuring tape like a parade streamer and Lucas consolidating the pile of stuffed animals as if they, too, had to be inventoried for a new life. Moving was hard and also liberating. For the first time in years, the rent I paid would not, even in part, be underwriting someone else's mortgage. It felt ridiculous to have to say that aloud, and yet it felt truer than anything I had said to myself in a long while. The reallocation of funds was a slow, sacred arithmetic. The $3,750 that once slid out of my account each month began to be parceled into things that felt like an actual investment in our future. I set up a $529 college account for Lily and Lucas and made the first modest deposit, an act so small and deliberate it felt ceremonial. I shuffled some of the remaining amount into a safety fund for medical bills, the kind of account that sits quiet and patient until it is needed. I paid for a moving company and a month's rent in advance, and I paid Marcus back in small installments for the sitter he had arranged and the extra hours he'd kept when I needed hands. Financially, it was not without pain. Cutting off a long-standing support structure forced me to reconsider appliance subscriptions, and habits I hadn't noticed had become costly. Budgeting became a daily practice that was at once humbling and empowering. I learned to be both strict and kind with myself, strict with the numbers, kind with the ways I replenished my heart. A frugal dinner could be a scavenger hunt of delight if I let it be. A night in with the twins, tracing constellations on the ceiling with a flashlight, could feel like a small luxury rather than a penalty. Emotionally, the work involved more than reorganizing a bank account. I had to face the shape of grief and the contours of anger. Some mornings I woke up and felt the old, private shame like an old coat I couldn't seem to take off. Other days I felt the thrill of someone who had finally decided her children and her life mattered first. I started seeing a counselor, not because of any dramatic crisis, but because my work was to learn the language of boundaries without guilt. In therapy, I learned the difference between failure to provide on someone else's part and responsibility on mine that had been misapplied for years. Naming that difference aloud in a chair made it have less power to haunt me. Vanessa oscillated between estrangement and attempts to reconcile. She sent a few awkward messages offering to help with the children's birthday party planning if I wanted it to be a big family thing. I declined politely. There were, inevitably, tense calls where she accused me of dramatizing things, and tender ones where she asked if I was all right. I let her be angry. I let her be hurt. I also stopped answering calls in the middle of the night when my patience was thin. Loving someone doesn't mean you must absorb their fury as a reflex. That was a lesson I had to learn, again and again. There were awkward community things. Two neighbors who used to smile with my parents now looked at me in a way that suggested they'd been forced to process a domestic ledger. A family friend who had once relied on me to pick up the slack at holiday get-togethers stopped inviting the twins to her elaborate 4th of July picnic. Those moments hurt. They were small slashes, social exclusions that, while petty in the grand scheme, stung like salt. But the sting dulled in time, much like the bruises from the surgery had. Time and a life rearranged around a new axis changed the way those social slights felt. They were, in the end, a form of choosing a revealing of where people had always been inclined to stand. As we settled into the new apartment, I found myself investing in rituals that were about repair and joy. We started a Saturday pancake morning where Lily insisted on adding sprinkles no matter the time of year. I baked loaves of bread with Lucas at my elbow. He took his role as chief pokers very seriously, ensuring each loaf was properly poked and declared acceptable. Marcus would occasionally drop by with leftovers from the hospital cafe, and the twins would insist on naming him Uncle Marcus on days when he helped most. Aunt Eleanor brought a plant that thrived in the kitchen window and said, "This will be a house that grows with you." Money, of course, does not heal the deeper fissures overnight. There were nights when my chest tightened and I could feel the old compulsion to apologize for existing. But each time that old script surfaced, I found I was becoming able to write a new one. I told myself to say, quietly and with no apology, "I chose my children." Saying it out loud shifted something in my body. It removed the question mark and replaced it with an assertion. There were practical, less melodramatic developments too. Vanessa's brand slowly recovered as she did the work of finding new clients and learning to manage cash flow without a cushion she had come to rely on. It was painful to watch her stumble and then get back up. I did not celebrate her missteps. If anything, watching her rebuild messy and human was a strange form of solace. She started doing smaller projects with more intentional pricing. Clients appreciated the attention that comes with constraint. It was not the same as before, but it was more sustainable. My parents downsized. They moved into a place with fewer rooms and a smaller mortgage. I received a text short and practical letting me know the sale had gone through. There was no flourish, no dramatic apology attached to the message. Later, a cousin mentioned to me, quietly, that my parents had been quieter at family events and that they seemed to prefer solitude. It was easy, in those moments, to let a part of me be vindictive. I had to steer myself back. The point of boundary setting wasn't to watch others suffer. It was to make space for the people I loved most to flourish without being eroded by a pattern that had once dominated my life. School started for me in a different mode than before. Being a physician doesn't stop when you set rules about your life. Some nights, I still took night shifts and long calls, but I started blocking large chunks of protected time to be fully present with Lily and Lucas' no calls. No pages, no mental accounting about what else I had to do. Those blocks were small sanctuaries. We would go to the library on Thursdays and pick out books like tiny treasure chests. We would visit the small museum downtown and make up names for each sculpture we saw. It is astonishing what a ritual that declares you come first can do for a small child's sense of stability. There were moments of unexpected connection, to a neighbor whose sister had once been a client of Vanessa's brought over a tray of offered to trade babysitting for soup on nights I had to work. A parent from the twins' preschool whose son shared a birthday with Lucas invited us to a playdate that turned into a months-long friendship. People showed up in mundane and meaningful ways when given a chance. The chosen family we had cultivated, Aunt Eleanor, Marcus' grandpa, and a few close cousins became a fabric that made our day-to-day life possible. I did not forget the ambulance text. It lived, for a while, like a small stone in the pocket of my heart, a thing I would occasionally turn over and remember why I had started this difficult work. But over Chimmy it lost its ability to shock me into action because the action had already been taken. The ledger had been read, the transfers stopped, the money redirected. Once those steps were made, the text became an artifact of why the boundary had been necessary rather than the thing that kept me awake. One bright spring afternoon, months after the party, I took Lily and Lucas to a small park near a new apartment. The sky was an honest, clear blue, and there was a breeze that carried the subtle, hopeful smell of cut grass. Lily ran toward the swings with the fierce concentration of someone who knows what she wants, and Lucas followed, laughing. I sat on a bench with a coffee and watched them. I allowed myself the simple pleasure of not calculating every momentary exercise I'd had to learn again. An old friend from residency, someone who had not known about the whole Ledger saga in detail, walked by with his dog and sat a respectful distance away to chat for a minute. He asked, casually, how things had been. I told him, briefly, about the new apartment and the kids, and how we'd been learning to make room for ourselves. He nodded like someone who had seen similar patterns in other people's lives and said something that lodged with me. You did what you needed to do to be a mother who is present. That's not selfish. It's survival with tenderness. That phrasing, survival with tenderness, felt right. It contained the hard edge and the soft center in a way that made sense to me. I had not acted out of vengeance, nor out of calculation. I had acted to ensure that if another crisis came, a bad diagnosis, another car accident, another night that demanded everything of me, there would be people who would answer the call for my children without a quibble. That was not cruelty. That was a kind of love that was practical, deliberate, and generous in its protection. There were still, of course, hard days. My parents and I exchanged terse messages at times. Vanessa sometimes reached out in the middle of the night with a burst of guilt and then retreated. I still had to manage the logistics of being both a resident and the primary caregiver of two toddlers. But the hard days no longer had the same shape. They didn't have that peculiar hollow where I wondered if I mattered enough to others to be prioritized. I knew now, increasingly, that I mattered to my children in ways that were visible, measurable, and repeatable. One afternoon, Grandpa stopped by with a small cardboard box. Inside was a photograph album of childhood pictures, a quiet thing. He handed it to me and said, simply, keep them. Keep your memories, but keep looking forward. There was no sermon in what he said. It was a gentle instruction. Collect the past where it lives, but let your life be defined by what you do now. I kept the ledger in a little notebook under my pillow for a long time, though I found its presence less and less necessary. Eventually I moved it to a small drawer with other things I'd gathered to help me remember. Not as a relic of betrayal, but as a document of a choice that had had real consequences and real costs and also real benefits. Months turned into a year. The twins' laughter filled rooms in a way that was not urgent but ordinary. Lily started preschool with a backpack 3 times her size and a solemn, proud stride that made me ache. Lucas learned to ride a tiny scooter and fell with a theatrical flair that made us laugh. I found that the small victories accumulated quietly, a night where I slept through, a call where I didn't apologize for needing care, a bank statement that ended with a small, growing number in a savings account labeled education. I still thought of my parents. Of course, there were days when I wondered if they'd ever fully understand what had led me to stop the transfers, whether they would ever say the words that felt like absolution. I don't expect neat endings. People are complex. My choice had been about creating a life where my children could be a priority that wasn't negotiated away. That, in itself, is a kind of ongoing work. What I learned in the wake of that ledger, and that ambulance, and that sharply cruel text is this: boundaries are not walls to keep people out. They are lines that tell you where you end and someone else begins. They are tools for placing those you love most at the center of your life. And the most radical act of love I could do for Lily and Lucas was to make sure their mother could keep breathing. Not everyone agreed with me. Some relatives still think I acted with unnecessary harshness. Some people are kinder in private than they are in public. Families, as it turns out, are ecosystems. I don't regret the work I did to clear a patch of ground where my children can grow. If there's one thing I hold on to now, it's this: choosing yourself is not a betrayal. It is, in the quiet of ordinary days, an offering. We teach our children how to treat them by the way we treat ourselves. When I tuck Lily and Lucas into bed, I do so with hands that are less tired from carrying everyone else's life and more present for the tiny battles and joys of theirs. Sometimes, late at night, I find myself thinking back to the ambulance and the metallic taste of panic and how shock narrows your choices to what is necessary. That night forced a clarity on me I had been avoiding for years. It was a sentence and a rupture I did not want, but it became the hinge upon which our new life turned. So now, on the other side of months that felt like a slow, steady excavation of truth and consequences, I live in a small apartment that smells of bread sometimes and paint other times. I work long hours and then come home to pancake mornings and dinosaur roars. I invest in my children's future with the same stubborn care I once invested in other people's comfort. I have chosen a family that stands with us, people who will answer the phone at 2 a.m. without hesitation, who will bring soup, and who will hold our hands without making us explain the cost of our choices. I tell this story not to make anyone feel ashamed nor to invite applause. I tell it because there are people out there who know what it is to be the invisible bank, the quiet supporter whose own life gets pawned for others' comforts. If you are one of those people, know this: choosing your children, your health, your life, and your dignity is not unkind. It is practical, it is necessary, and it is loving in a way that endures. If this story resonated, please like and subscribe, and if you have a boundary story of your own, leave it in the comments. I read every one, and sometimes the smallest shared truth is the thing that lets someone else stop carrying alone.